So, Lori, this week we saw the final nail in the coffin of the TPP, only the TPP. Largely, this was anticipated, even if Donald Trump didn't take this sort of extra, victory lap showboating a little bit by signing an executive order. Nevertheless, good news. I mean, you and I have been talking about this trade deal for, I think, about 3 or 4 years now. At that time, we were talking about it could very well be shot down by the right, simply because it, in many respects, created a one world regime, or an attempt at it. It ended up being brought down by a wave of populism, both on the left and the right, over the past couple of years here. But tell us, broadly speaking, tell us what this deal did and what it means that it's dead.
The TPP was described as a trade agreement, but what it really did was expand and lock in a variety of enormous new corporate powers, including for individual foreign companies to demand unlimited compensation by suing the U.S. government before tribunals of 3 corporate attorneys to demand payment for any U.S. policy, state, local, or federal court decision, government action that they claimed undermined the new corporate rights and privileges the agreement would grant them. And these decisions were not subject to appeal. It also gave corporations new rights, new protections to avoid competition in the pharmaceutical industry from generic medicines that would bring down consumer prices. Plus, there was a chapter that literally created incentives to offshore more jobs to low-wage countries, and another chapter that banned the use of buy local, buy green, buy America policies when our government spends our tax dollars for procurement. And it was an international campaign over the 7 years of negotiations that got the agreement pushed back from the original date it was supposed to be signed in 2012. And our international partners helped push it right square into the U.S. presidential race, which then basically let all this work happen over the last year that ensured that they could never get a majority in Congress to pass it. So now Donald Trump has basically buried the moldering corpse of an agreement signed a year ago that never could get through Congress.
So I've got a couple of questions that I've had throughout this process, and let me ask you those before we go further in terms of the implications of Trump signing and the status of other agreements that are very similar to it. So we had there were multiple parts, obviously, of this so-called trade deal. We have already pre-existing trade deals with almost all the countries involved in this deal, right? We have bilateral treaties with the vast majority of these countries, and stop me if I'm wrong here. And there's also was a tremendous amount of research showing that the amount of economic activity that was anticipated as a function of this deal was really largely insignificant. So what was this about from your perspective, and what was it about supposedly from the administration's perspective? I mean, because there's a couple of things in there that we have that are features of this deal, and I wonder if in some ways this deal wasn't to set precedent for future deals, like in particular the state investor dispute resolution mechanism or other, patent regimes. But from your perspective, what was the logic of this deal on the part of those who were pushing it, and from the perspective, what was articulated to us?
Well, what was really behind it was the agenda of the 500, literally 500 official U.S. trade advisors who represent corporate interests, who are able to call the shots on the agreement. So for them, it was a way to expand and then permanently lock in a whole set of rights and privileges. Every country who is a signatory, had to conform all of their domestic laws to all the TPP rules. And of TPP's 30 chapters, only 6 of them had anything to do with trade. So it was rewriting financial regulation, food safety, access to medicine rules, internet governance, investment in local development policy, land use policy, environmental policy, energy policy. And it's not subject to change. You could have a revolution, an election, whatever changes your government, you're still locked in, and there's no timeout for the agreement. So that the U.S. is not a part of that thing anymore, and that it is toast is great news for people on the planet. Now, once it became clear, once the studies got done, that there was no merits of selling the agreement as an economic gain, because there just weren't any trade gains to speak of. Even the most biased sources of studies came up with really minuscule potential gains. Once that became clear, then the story the other side used to sell it was necessary for foreign policy. It was our bolster against China. And that was crazy, too, because the agreement's rules, for instance, gave benefits under the trade agreement to products that had up to 65% Chinese content. So actually that whole line about wouldn't you rather write the rules, TPP, instead of having China write the rules, these weren't U.S. rules. These were corporate rules, and China didn't need to write them. They got a free ride because their corporations would be able to get product into the U.S. under the agreement without the Chinese government having to follow any of the rules. So to the extent there were any good rules in there, the Chinese government didn't have to follow them. And up to 65% of the value of a product could come in duty-free under the agreement without China even being a member. So the notion that somehow this was going to be a counter force against China was just silliness. And actually some of the honest former State Department and sort of China experts started to say that towards the end. And then there was just no argument for it at all, which is part of why there was no majority in Congress.
Yeah, I mean, and so was this just a purely from the perspective of the Obama administration, which was pushing this so hard, purely a corporate giveaway? I mean, we've heard quite a bit about this sort of, and like you mentioned this, you don't want China to write the rules and I'm not even sure exactly how that works in practice per se. If people want to make deals with the United States and they're not part of the negotiations. They're not part of the negotiations. They're going to have to meet U.S. standards if they want part of our market, or I guess if we want part of their market, lowering our standards. It's always easier, it seems to me, than getting others to raise their standards on some level. But what was the national security argument about the Asia pivot?
Well, the whole argument was, other countries will get into partnership with us. If we give them these new goodies, their corporations, goodies and rights, it's the U.S. Treasury and our laws, then somehow they'll be closer to us. And as all the national security experts who looked at that argument said, well, wait a minute. You think somehow something we do on a piece of paper called a so-called trade agreement is more important than, like, the U.S. Navy protecting Japan and the other signatories of the agreement? You think that somehow the thing that makes the partners in Latin have alliances with the U.S. isn't common interests on security or drug interdiction, but rather some piece of paper? That's ridiculous. These countries that are close to China are going to have China as their main trade partner, as New Zealand and Australia and others do. The rules we're writing are not going to make us stronger. They're going to hollow out our own national defense. And these other countries are not going to feel somehow more affinity to us, more than they already do on defense issues, because they already rely on us for defense. And so it just became clear this was sort of a distraction argument. Once the economic argument was debunked, the next thing to do was to just try and distract people and say, ooh, China, this will help.
And we're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to test out that argument about this being about Pacific security when we discuss the TTIP and, I guess, the TISA in just a moment with Lori Wallach. She's the director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch, and we're talking about the death of the TPP, which was, I guess, dropped in the coffin and buried this past week. We got to take a quick break. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio.